Today is Sunday, July 19th, 2020, which means it's another podcast day. Hello, fiendlings. How the hell are you? I'm back. Back from my latest business trip and back home in front of the mic and the computer and, well, everything else is expected, I guess. There are a lot of things going on that I can't talk about, but you'll have to forgive any sporadic absences on Fridays for a few weeks. I'm doing my best to can up episodes for y'all, and I imagine I'll still be able to check in week to week. But sometimes life just kind of has its own plans. I might be in that spot right now. Derelict Shipyards, the final book in the Derelict saga, currently stands at 12,000 words. In some ways, I can't believe it's moving in my head as fast as it is. Guess getting away from the house and writing somewhere new helped. We'll see. Quite soon, I'm going to have to slow down and do some outlining, something I loathe, but something I'll have to do to finish the ride. Well, it's time for me to say farewell for the week. Be safe, and that means please wear a fucking mask when in public for your safety as much as others. Have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 10 of Legends of Garaaga. Neratal slipped and fell twice as he and Darien descended the hillside. The forest canopy kept most sunlight from reaching the ground, ensuring there was little undergrowth to shore it up. The previous night's rain had turned the fertile soil into a muddy bog. They heard the roaring river long before they could see it. A number of trees had fallen from the heavy winds and lightning strikes, but the forest was still too thick to provide a clear view. The river had jumped its banks. Where before there had been a wide divide between the forest and the green water, the river had swallowed the bank completely. "Gods," Darien whispered. "I don't think we'll be walking any today." "Aye, unless we're going to cut a trail through the forest." Neratal found a gap in the trees and stared at the sky. "I think another storm is coming for us as well." "Even if it's not, the water will keep rising." "Agreed. I think perhaps we stay in camp today." Darien clucked his tongue. "Excuse me for saying so, sir, but I think we might have a problem with the lad." "Speak." "Thank you, sir. I think he's taken too much of a shine to the girl." After Darien had cooked the strips of swine for their breakfast, the three men had eaten. Neratal had tried to wake Elliston, but to no avail. The fever's grip had become too strong. It was the same sickness that had killed two of his other scouts, and the sleep that had taken them was its last stage. Aquila had eaten his breakfast in great gulps, barely chewing the tough, sinewy meat. When he finished, he'd walked to the woman and begun untying her hands. "What are you doing?" "She should be able to feed and water herself, sir." Neratal had ground his teeth. "No, soldier. We don't know who she is or what she'll do. You feed her, you water her, but do not untie her. Understood?" Through clenched teeth, Aquila had acknowledged the order. It was the first time Neratal had ever seen any sign of insubordination from the scout. Aquila had returned to the fire, pulled a spit of meat, and fed the woman. Neratal had watched her eat the tough meat from the spit with ease. As the woman downed the food, she made little sounds of pleasure, smiling at the young soldier. The grin on Aquila's face had filled him with disquiet. Against his better judgment, he left the boy alone with the woman, taking Darien to the river instead. Neratal was afraid if he stayed in camp, he'd do something rash. "Have you seen anything strange?" Darien kept his eyes on the swollen, rushing river. "Dreams. Just dreams." The woman. "Aye. That and something else." "What?" The old soldier paused. "Eyes, sir." He turned to Neratal, his face set in a grimace. I thought I saw her eyes change." Neratal's pulse quickened. "To what?" "Red, silver, several colors. They look dead to me." "What dreams, Darien? What dreams have you had?" "Laying with her, and then dying in a beast's embrace." "Without control of yourself?" "Aye," Darien spat. "Same dream?" "Yes." "Thing from the altar?" "Yes." The pair were silent for a moment. The river's endless growl obliterated any bird song or insect sound the forest might have held. "We should kill her, sir." Neratal nodded. "I saw her in the river the night before we went into the village." Darien turned and blinked. "She was near the boulder. It's how I found the path." "Naiadi," Neratal nodded. "Something like that. She was singing." "Singing what?" I don't know. It was..." Neratal pursed his lips. "It was beautiful." "Siren." Neratal laughed. "You spent too much time with Alexander's tutor." "Perhaps." Darien looked up into the forest canopy. "We never dreamed we'd be in a place like this. Strange animals, strange weather, new gods, new monsters." Darien clucked his tongue. "Pardon me, sir, but what do you plan to do about Aquila?" "I don't know, but we should get back." "Aye." The pair turned from the roaring river and made their way back to the mud-strewn path. Neratal blinked at the silent campsite. "Check Elliston." Darien stepped toward the tree the ill soldier was slumped against. Neratal turned around in a slow circle, trying to make out breaks in the branches. He saw none. "He still lives," Darien said. 2 coils of rope sat at the base of a tree. Neratal picked them up and placed them in his pack. The woman and Aquila were gone. "Sir?" "Thank you, Darien. He still burns?" "Aye, more so than ever." Neratal nodded. "How much more pig do we have?" "There's none left, sir." "None left," Neratal echoed. "We'll hole up here until Elliston passes." "Sir, do we bother searching?" The boy had betrayed him. Of all the soldiers, Aquila and Darien had been the most loyal, never questioning orders, always respectful, and quick to act. Now Aquila is armed and somewhere in the forest with the woman. He'll only be found if he wants to be. Neratal turned and sighed. "Wish I knew what he was thinking." "Aye. Perhaps he thought you'd hurt her." "Perhaps he knew I would kill her." Darien nodded. "This is a bad place to hole up, sir. It's on a hill, which is good, but we're vulnerable from all sides." "The only other choice is to leave Elliston to die alone. I'll not do that." "I can scout for better, and we can move him." Neratal clucked his tongue. "If the boy attacks, can you take him?" The old soldier chuckled. "Not as well as you, but if I can't, you'll certainly hear about it." Neratal glanced at Elliston, and then back at Darien. "We both go. We take Elliston with us." "Who's going to carry him?" "I will. I need your sword ready." "Sir!" Darien smiled. "I'll need your help with my pack." "Aye." Neratal looked up through the space in the canopy. Dark clouds, swollen with rain, had filled the sky. "We're going to get wet again, and soon." "Aye. The king's ill will follows us." Neratal removed his pack and handed it to Elliston. "Whatever happens, soldier, do not lose that pack. It has the book. If we lose that, we lose our chance to return to the kingdom." Darien nodded. He took the offered pack and slung it over his shoulder, along with his own. "What about Elliston's?" "Leave it. I fear he won't be needing it by tomorrow." The going was slow. Neratal had lifted Elliston and thrown the man over his shoulder like a bale of wheat. He'd expected the man to weigh him down, but Elliston had wasted away in the last few days, becoming nothing more than a breathing, flesh-covered shell. Neratal and Darien walked through the mud, doing their best to be silent. The old soldier was on point, carefully choosing each step. Neratal's eyes were on the ground, trying to match Darien's footprints with his own. If for some reason Aquila decided to hunt them down, it would be best for him to think he was tracking one man instead of two. Neratal doubted the young man would be fooled by the trick, but regardless, it was worth trying. Frigid raindrops fell through the trees in fits and starts. The exertion of carrying Elliston and walking were the only things keeping him warm. His tattered tunic was soaked and clinging to his body. Darian slipped in the mud and nearly fell. The old soldier let out a nearly silent curse and then kept marching forward. Neratal stepped carefully through the muddy footprint, his eyes still cast down. He nearly bumped into Darian when the man stopped. Neratal looked up. Darian's head was cocked to one side. Neratal slowed his breathing and listened. He heard a moan. It sounded like Aquila. Darian looked back at his tired leader and nodded his head toward the sound. Neratal nodded in return. The old soldier scanned the forest, found what he was looking for, and then stepped through a small space in the trees. Neratal followed, although it was difficult swinging Elliston's body through the gap. Darian walked on his toes, dodging brambles and branches. The moans became louder. Neratal fought the urge to call out to Aquila, to ask if he was okay. The boy had betrayed him, but he was still a scout. Neratal's scout. Darian crept further through the brush. Neratal lifted Elliston from his shoulder with a wince and propped the unconscious man against a small tree. Without the extra weight and bulk, he moved to follow Darian and then stopped. Everything around them smelled like a woman in heat. A tickle in his loins turned into a pull. His manhood hardened in response. Darian had stopped as well, his head raised to the trees. Neratal fought the urge to touch himself and release the sudden need, instead reaching forward and tapping Darian on the shoulder. The old soldier stiffened and then turned around. He shook his head as if trying to clear it. Darian touched a finger to his temple and then cast his eyes downward. Neratal twirled his fingers, and Darian turned around. Neratal helped him out of the packs, laying them next to Elliston. Once they were on the ground, he tapped Darian on the shoulder and then resumed walking through the brush. Every snap of a branch or swish of leaves made him wince, but the sounds of coupling were louder. Neratal hoped Aquila was too distracted to hear their approach. Another sound joined Aquila's moans, those of a woman's. The smell of sex, the pull on his loins, was still palpable. Neratal struggled to keep the need at bay, his mind filled with visions of the woman's naked body splayed on the boulder, inviting his entry. He clenched his teeth and continued to follow Darian. After more than a dozen steps, Darian crouched. Neratal followed suit, peering over his shoulder. Through a break in the brush, he saw the couple. The woman lay on Aquila's tunic. The boy was on her, his buttocks moving with each thrust. Moans of pleasure escaped him. Then Neratal heard it, whispering. The woman was speaking in that strange language, soft and coaxing. Her body glowed with a strange light. Her nails dragged down Aquila's back, leaving red marks on his naked skin. Darian sighed. The woman raised her head and stared over Aquila's shoulder at them. The look of pleasure on her face dissolved into a malevolent grin. Her eyes turned from a dark brown to blood red. One of her hands lengthened, the nails turning into talons. They flicked against Aquila's back, tearing off shreds and leaving tracks of blood. Aquila groaned but continued thrusting. The dream filled Neratal's mind, the thing clamping around him, suffocating him, and crushing his penis. "No!" he yelled. Aquila turned his head, and Neratal's breath hitched. The young man had aged. Wrinkles and lines marred his face. His eyes were deep-set and glassy. "Aquila," Neratal whispered. The former scout screamed and leaped off the woman, staggering, his bloody, ruined penis erect. The woman slowly stood, her teeth elongating. "Run!" Darian yelled. Neratal crashed through the brush, Darian on his heels. Aquila howled something. When they reached Elliston, Neratal knelt. Darian flipped the man onto Neratal's shoulder and grabbed the pack. Brambles and branches scraped his skin and removed chunks of flesh from his face and legs, but Neratal barely noticed. The river. They had to get to the river. Neratal's feet struggled to keep upright. Elliston's body was throwing him off balance, but he wasn't about to let the man go. Not if it meant leaving him at the thing's mercy. Somewhere in the forest, Aquila howled again. Neratal fought the urge to turn and ensured Darien was behind him. The rain was still falling, and between its rush through the trees and moving through the brush, he couldn't hear anything else. He spied the hill up ahead. Breathing hard, his feet pumping, he made the ascent. His lungs burned, breath coming in gasps, but he kept moving. On the other side of the hill, he slipped and slid down onto the muddy path to the river. Darien slid down next to him, his sword in one hand. He held out his free hand to Neratal. As Neratal reached for it, a scream filled the forest. Aquila sprang from the trees lining the path. He crashed into Darien, knocking him into the mud beside Neratal and Elliston. Neratal tried to rise, but slipped again. Darien flipped himself over and managed to raise himself using a small tree. Aquila, naked and covered in mud, stood and growled. He swung his sword, aiming for Neratal's head. Darien's xiphos slid beneath and deflected the blow. Sparks flew from the scraping metal. Aquila leapt backwards, his sword pointed toward Darien. The old soldier wiped mud from his face and smiled. "Sorry we made you leave your whore," he panted. Aquila screamed and attacked. His blade swished through the air in short diagonals. Darien countered each one, stepping forward and forcing his assailant to step back. He bobbed his head and feinted. Neratal scrabbled with his hands, desperately trying to get to his feet. He slipped and fell to one knee just as Aquila's sword carved the air above his head. Darien pushed forward, putting himself between Neratal and the crazed soldier. Aquila's sword scraped off Darien's and slashed against his side. A rope of blood jetted from the wound, spattering Neratal's face. Darien grunted in response and kicked. His sandaled foot connected with Aquila's sword arm, knocking him back. Darien feinted and slipped in the mud. Aquila thrust forward and slashed a diagonal across the older man's chest. Darien hissed and then lifted his blade. Aquila's forward momentum had put him in range. The xiphos' point stabbed into Aquila's shoulder. Aquila screamed in pain as dark blood flowed from the wound. Darien wrenched his sword free of muscle and tissue. Aquila, still screaming, swung his sword at Darien. Darien ducked under the blade and then kicked Aquila in the chest. Feet slipping in the mud, Aquila fell to the ground with a wet plop. Darien leapt forward, his sword held in both hands. The point pierced Aquila's chest. The young man screamed in agony. Darien twisted on the hilt. The scream died. Aquila dropped his blade, twitched, and then lay still. Neratal managed to find his feet. "Gods," he whispered. Darien pulled free his sword as he rose from Aquila's corpse. He spat and turned toward Neratal, a grim smile on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, and then his eyes grew wide. "Move!" Darien screamed. Neratal jumped to the tree line. Something heavy landed to his right. He turned and froze. The thing from the altar had landed a few paces away with a muddy squelch. The thing's triangular head slowly turned toward him, a rope of spittle falling from its glistening teeth. It raised a taloned claw toward him and growled. "Garaaga!" The thing fell backward as Darien's body slammed into it. "Get Elliston! Flee!" Darien flung a pack at Neratal's feet and stood above the creature. He slashed down, his sword clanging off the thing's flesh. Neratal stumbled past Darien and the howling creature. He crouched and lifted the unconscious Elliston, groaning as something gave loose in his back. He flipped the man onto his shoulder, grabbed the pack with his free hand, and began running toward the river. He turned around when he heard Darien scream. The thing held the old soldier by the throat. Darien's sword arm continued swinging, the xiphos scraping and sparking against the creature's flesh. The thing swung its free arm sideways. Darien's body went limp in its arms as blood spattered against the mud. Its maw snapped forward, and Darien's head disappeared. Neratal turned and ran as fast as he could. The river was mere paces away when his ears heard the fast, heavy footfalls above the rushing water's roar. Screaming in terror, he flung himself forward into the frothing, dark river. He crashed beneath its surface. The current pulled him down toward the river bottom. Out of breath, Neratal struggled to rise. Elliston's body threatened to slip away, and Neratal clamped down with one hand, kicking toward the surface as hard as he could. He broke above the water, facing upriver. Elliston's body floated next to him. In the twilight, he saw a pair of crimson eyes staring at him. The woman stood at the head of the path, one arm freakishly long. In its taloned claws, she held a severed arm, a xiphos still clutched in its dead fingers. The sounds of men conversing, cargo being loaded, and the gentle lap of the river woke him. Neratal took a deep breath and then broke into a coughing fit. A hand reached out, holding a wooden cup. Neratal looked up and smiled. Phyllis returned his smile and nodded to the cup. Neratal took it from his hands and swallowed a trickle of water. He took a shallow breath and handed back the cup. "How long?" "A night," Phyllis said. "I sent a messenger to the king. He'll be happy to know you live." Neratal leaned over and spat on the wooden floor. 3 long days in the river. 3 long days of clutching Elliston's corpse and using it as a raft as they rushed through the valley. The storms had ceased, but the roaring river continued to swell. He had tried to reach shore several times, but the river's current had been too swift. By the second day, Elliston's bloated body was all that had kept him from drowning. Exhaustion and hunger had taken over by then, making it impossible for him to do more than hang on. The days had been spent shivering in the cold water, his face burning from the sun's constant exposure. The nights had been filled with terror. Every time he closed his eyes, he'd seen the thing, its glistening teeth, burning eyes, and taloned arms. Sometimes it carried Darian's severed head. Other times, it carried his own. When he finally reached shore on the 3rd day, he'd removed the soaked pack he'd tied to Elliston's body. "Goodbye, Scout," he'd whispered, and then kicked the body back into the current. He'd watched the river take Elliston downstream in its roaring embrace. The sickness that had killed Elliston had seized him once on shore. The fever made him sizzle with each step as he followed the river. Somehow, he'd managed a day of cough-filled walking before he fell into unconsciousness. When he awoke, he had no idea how many days or nights had passed. It was dawn, and the river had finally receded enough to obey its banks. He thought about slitting his own throat, or unsheathing the xiphos and piercing his own heart. His men were dead. He would never again laugh at Darian's antics, or try to make the boy Aquila smile. He would never lead again, and without the wars, was there really any point in living? It was then he'd remembered the book, the thing, and the village. He'd stumbled down the river bank once more, concentrating on each step. The woman's song had radiated from the river. The creature's face had stared at him from the tree line. The wind had carried the screams of his dead men. And each time he thought to lay down and die, they reminded him why he should not, would not, let it happen. His body had failed him inside of houses near the river's widening mouth. When he'd awakened, brown faces stared down at him, mopped his brow, and fed him a strange gruel. Men dressed in smart tunics had visited him. Through his fever dreams, he remembered them asking questions. Darian had stood beside him, the old soldier's arms crossed, a thin smile on his bearded face. "You need to tell them, sir," the old man had grumbled. "Tell them everything." Blood had dripped from the old soldier's chest. His head disappeared, and then his body had faded away. Neratal remembered talking, but had no idea what he'd said. He didn't know how long he'd been in the house on the river. The first time he'd awakened and recovered his wits, he realized Phyllis and 7 other soldiers from the king's army had found him. The villagers, plied with coin and threat of the sword, had attended him. What will the messenger say? That you live, you have a story, and an artifact. Why should the king care if a fellow countryman dies here? He wanted us dead. Phyllis sighed. Neratal, the Indus campaign is over. The Macedonians mutinied, demanded Alexander return to the kingdom and forget this accursed place. Neratal swallowed hard. My men died for nothing. We struck out into exile only to have the king change his mind and risk others to find us. Neratal spat once more. A fool's errand, a fool's decision, and our countrymen are those that brought him back to sanity. Phyllis looked around as if to ensure they were alone. He leaned close to Neratal. Keep your tongue, old friend, or my soldiers might remove it. Not all of them know what we know. What we know, Neratal whispered. The book. Have you? Phyllis nodded. I've looked at it. He clucked his tongue. One of the men of Lothal saw its cover. He ran screaming. Neratal turned on his side, lifting his head with a tired arm. Screaming. I sent man after him, but he disappeared. We have to leave, Neratal whispered. We must. Phyllis scrunched his brows. We can't, not until Alexander sends back word. Neratal shook his head. He felt a shiver of fear. No, we must. To where? Out of the Indus, anywhere, now. Babylon, Alexandria, I don't care, but we have to leave. Phyllis scratched his beard. You fear Garaaga. Neratal opened his mouth to speak and then stopped. What did I tell you? Enough, Phyllis said. The villagers, Phyllis. If they know we have the book, they may send men. We could die here while we wait for a messenger. Neratal saw the look of disbelief on the man's face. You and I, we saved Alexander dozens of times in battle. For every strike of a sword on my shield, you took one as well. Believe me, please, we have to leave. I have not succumbed to Pan, believe me. Phyllis shook his head. My friend, these people are cows to slaughter. They'll not dare. We have to leave, Phyllis, now. If we leave now, you could die on the sea. The men of Lothal told us as much. Our translators said the herbs to hinder the illness do not always cure it. Without them every day, you might burn away. Neratal lay back on the hard pallet. I'm already dead, Phyllis. He closed his eyes. I died in the river with my exiled brothers. The king wishes to have you back, Neratal. He wants... It doesn't matter. Neratal's breathing broke it down into coughs and wheezes. Phyllis held out the cup to him, but Neratal knocked it aside, spilling water on the sheets. His old friend shrank back. Neratal's eyes burned. Take me out of here, or kill me now, but do not waste any more time. They carried him on a litter to the long boat. He was still too weak to walk. The cacophonous dock fell silent as Phyllis and his men boarded the boat. Perhaps, Phyllis whispered, perhaps you were right. Neratal sat up from his place on the bow. A group of men clothed in crimson robes stood in a small circle on the other side of the dock. They parted. Neratal shivered as a woman walked between them, her face hidden within the confines of a hood. Phyllis's men kicked the boat away from the dock, their strong arms paddling it into the current. Phyllis yelled orders to them. Neratal's breath caught in his lungs when the woman raised her head. Two glowing coals stared back at him. He coughed and spat a wad of phlegm on the bow. When he raised his head back to the dock, she was gone.